Hey guys, we are back with another Hell's Kitchen chef ranking, and today we're actually breaking away from the order here as we recently finished a new season of the show, that being season 22, The American Dream. So today I'll be breaking from the order to do a chef ranking for this season, and this was definitely an interesting season to cover as it was the first season that I ever watched live, and being able to watch it play out in real time was definitely an interesting experience and also ties into the actual rankings, but we'll get to that more in a moment. But there are 18 chefs to talk about, and not to waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, the chef I believe did the worst on this season is unsurprisingly the first boot of the season, and here we have Tad. And Tad was pretty clearly an outlier here, definitely someone who definitely didn't cut it compared to the rest of the competition here. And there really isn't much to praise about his run here. I mean, bad signature dish, really bad in fact. But even beyond that, he has a pretty bad service where he's on the meat station, and he kind of has a lot of trouble communicating with Brad for a lot of it. He ends up making a ton of mistakes, his team gets kicked out of the kitchen, and by the end, it was a pretty cut and dry case of him being the weakest chef, and sure enough, he was the first boot here. So again, not too surprising that he's at the bottom, which is why he's here number 18. Now moving on to number 17, we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Claudia. And while Claudia wasn't as dunked on in the edit compared to Tad, I mean, she was still clearly the weakest chef on the red team. Bad signature dish to start. I will say her service 1 isn't that bad, or while the show blames her for being the reason the red team gets kicked out, where she asks for time on the chicken after Ramsay finished scolding them, I feel like by that point, Ramsay was just kind of fed up with the service anyway, so I don't really blame her too much for that. But then service 2 is pretty bad, where she's on the fish station, she makes tons of mistakes there, and she kind of just seems a bit aloof for a lot of it, and by the end, she's clearly cut for being the weakest link there. Again, I feel like there's not too much to praise with Claudia's run here, and I feel like she didn't really have much potential within the game, so because of that, I have her here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Mateus. And Mateus's run is pretty mediocre as well. Now he actually has an okay signature dish, which is definitely a plus over the previous two people we talked about. And his service 1 isn't that bad, where he doesn't really make too many mistakes there. But obviously his next 2 services are pretty bad, where in service 2, he's on the meat station, and he ends up making a ton of mistakes there, where even Jonathan has to jump into a station. Again, all of that's a pretty bad look, and he's eventually put up on the block for this. And even though he does survive this round, we have Ramsay telling him he's on thin ice. And then service 3, he just continues to flounder, where he's on the fish station. He makes a ton of mistakes there, and he's eventually taken out for not improving. So again, it's another pretty mediocre run. Nothing too much to praise about his run here, which is why he's here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we are actually breaking away from the boot order slightly, but we do have Brad. And I feel like Brad's run is also pretty mediocre here. Now, obviously the main thing to point to is that he did have to leave the game for medical reasons, where he had recently had surgery, and that was obviously impacting his performance, and he does eventually leave the game after service 5. So I guess that's something you can give him, but beyond that, he doesn't really have too much to praise. Where his service 1 is pretty bad on the meat station, he ends up on the block for this after making tons of mistakes there, and while Tad was always going home over him, it still wasn't great on his end there. Service 2 having been nominated again for not helping much, despite him trying to help out the others after completing the appetizers, which I did find pretty funny there, but kind of speaks to how people just didn't really want his help in a lot of ways. Service 3 is actually pretty okay, where he's once again on the appetizers, doesn't really make any mistakes. But then service 4 is pretty inconsistent, where while he does make a couple of good dishes on the fish station, he also makes plenty of mistakes there. He also has really bad communication, where he doesn't talk to Gordon. He also calls out a wrong order, which gets on Ramsay's nerves, and he eventually has to be pulled aside by Ramsay, which is all pretty bad, and he probably would have gone up had his team lost a service, but obviously the blue team won that. And then we get to his boot round in service 5, where by that point you can tell that he was being dragged down by his health, but obviously that service is also pretty bad. And even though he does leave the game after the service due to his declining health, he probably would have been eliminated anyway, considering how badly he had performed across the first couple services. So again, I feel like there's very little to praise with Brad's game, outside of him having an okay service and also having a good signature dish, but really I don't really see his run as that impressive. So because of that, I do have him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and once again, we're not quite sticking with the boot order, but we do have Ranisha. And Ranisha's run is also pretty rocky. where she doesn't have the best signature dish in the world where she undercooks the grits. And in service 1, she's just relegated to tableside, so not much to speak there. But then we get to service 2, her first actual service in the kitchen, where she ends up making a ton of mistakes there. And she very well could have been nominated here, but is largely spared that due to Claudia and Danya making bigger mistakes there. We then get to service 3, where she also doesn't do that great, making a mistake. She also lies to Christina, which is a pretty big no-no, but her team ends up winning the service, so whatever. We then get to service 4, where she ends up making a pretty big mistake on the meat station, where she ends up putting up dishes before they're ready. And again, she largely avoids nomination due to her team winning that service. And then we get to her boot round in service 5, where again, she once again has a lot of trouble on the fish station. She ends up making several mistakes. She also doesn't communicate well with Ramsay, and she's just put up and eliminated due to her inconsistent performance. So I find it to be a pretty rough ride during a lot of it. I feel like she largely gets as far as she does due to her team winning a lot of the services early on, as I feel like she probably could have been taken out earlier had they lost some of those services. But again, she at least had some pros over people like Tad and Claudia, so I do have her here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, we are now moving back to the earliest boot left on the board, and here we have Melissa. And I consider putting Melissa a little higher considering she isn't shown making that many mistakes before her boot episode, where yes, she does lie to Christina during a punishment in episode 3, which again, why are you lying to a sous chef? But again, before her boot round, a lot of her game is just kind of fine, where she has a good signature dish, a lot of her services are pretty fine, doesn't make too many mistakes. But again, her boot round is pretty bad, where she gets pretty upset after losing the challenge, which really spills over into the actual service, where she just doesn't communicate well with her team. And with her negative attitude and just shutting down, it just causes her team to get fed up with her to where she gets put up and eventually taken out there. So again, it is a pretty drastic downfall for someone like Melissa, considering a lot of her run before that was just kind of fine. But again, with her being a key contributor to her own downfall, I do have to leave her here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we are still sticking with the boot order, and here we have Germaine. Where a lot of Germaine's run is just kind of average, where again, he has a good senior judicial start, and he's on tableside in service 1, so not too much to say there. Service 2, he is shown making a mistake on the meat station, but again, it's not really enough to knock him all the way down. Service 3, again, he is on the garnish station, doesn't really do anything wrong there. But then Service 4, he kind of struggles on the meat station again, where he ends up messing up some Wellingtons, and that annoys Ramsay a lot. But again, his team wins the service, so whatever. We get to Service 5, where he struggles on the fish station and he makes some mistakes there. And he's even blindsided at the elimination, where he came into it thinking that Devon was going up, only for his team to put him up instead. So that's pretty bad. And then we get to his boot round, where again, it's a pretty bad service. He's on the garnish station. He has pretty bad communication, also makes tons of mistakes there to where Demir jumps into his station, and he's eventually put up and eliminated for this bad service. So again, it's a pretty unremarkable run, nothing too crazy to point out with his run in the grand scheme of things, outside of his downfall in the last couple of episodes. So because of that, I do have him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and very similar to Germaine, this person's run is also pretty average, and here we have Devon. And again, Devon's run just feels pretty average to me, where he has an average signature dish where it's a bit too sweet. His service 1 isn't great, but I feel like he was largely dragged down by Jason, where due to Jason's mistakes, he ended up looking bad, but obviously he's able to escape nomination there. His next few services are just kind of fine. He doesn't really make any mistakes during them. He even tells Ryan in service 3 to get a grip, which I find pretty funny. But then we get to service 4, where he does make a mistake on the fish station, where he ends up putting up a dish before the scallops are ready, which obviously gets on Ramsay's nerves. Service 5 also isn't great, where he makes some mistakes on the meat station, but he's able to avoid nomination there. But then we get to service 6, where he has another pretty bad service on the meat station, and this time he actually is nominated, only for him to get out of it. But by service 7, he's clearly seen as the weakest chef on the blue team, and he's thrown into the challenge, and obviously that's what takes him out, where obviously he ends up making a pretty fatal mistake by slicing the meat 6 times before it's actually ready, and obviously that's why he's eventually eliminated there for having the worst dish. And while I can point out that he didn't go out due to a service, it was more so due to a challenge performance, I feel like he probably would have gone out soon anyway, as he was already seen as one of the weakest links on his team. So again, in a lot of ways, his run is just kind of average. while he has a couple of okay services, it's not really enough to save him by the end of it. So he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who is also a relatively mediocre player, and here we have Sandra. And Sandra was a tough player to assess as well, as even though she does get all the way to 10th place, I feel like her run there is pretty rocky, where right off the bat she has a bad signature dish, which isn't great. And beyond that, she has a pretty inconsistent service one where, while she does have a good dish at the beginning, she obviously has bad communication with a Toya, and she also makes a mistake there. And she's eventually nominated at the service, though considering Tad was such an outlier, I feel like she had no shot at going home there. Again, service 2 is kind of whatever, but then we get to service 3, where she struggles a lot with communication, and while she does eventually turn it around, she also annoys both Ramsey and her team. Service 4 is also not great, where she's on the fish station, she makes some mistakes there, and is eventually nominated for her second time, but is able to scrape through that. We then get to service 5, which I'll admit is a bit of a rocky round for her, where while she is nominated here, I feel like a lot of that is due to her performance in the challenge, more so than what she does during the service, where obviously she does very much sink her team during the challenge, but again, she doesn't really make any mistakes during the service, so I feel like that's a bit of a wonky state. We get to service 6, where again is another pretty rocky service on the meat station. We then get to service 7, where she's thrown into the Cook for Your Life challenge, which obviously isn't great. And while she does manage to get her safety there, I feel like it's not ideal that she's in that position to begin with. And I actually think she does pretty well at the following service for the most part, not making too many mistakes until the tail end of it. But then we get to probably her biggest flaw in our game, where she volunteers to go up on the block, despite her service not being that bad. And obviously that's very much what leads to her elimination, where Ramsey feels like she doesn't believe in herself, and that why should he believe in her? So on the whole, I do find it to be a pretty rough game to assess, where admittedly there are some high points along the way, but I feel like her downfall is solely on her. I feel like it was a pretty unforced error. Then also she has some pretty inconsistent services, and she was kind of looked at as a weakness to her team in the grand scheme of things, to where I couldn't really have her any higher than number 10. Now moving on to number 9, we have probably the most controversial chef on the season, but we do have Jason. And obviously a lot of people don't like Jason. They're calling him like the new age villain of the show. And admittedly, based off the seasons that I've seen so far, I feel like after seeing Elise on season 9, I feel like Jason's definitely a step down from her. But if we are looking at his track record, it is an incredibly bumpy one, where he comes into the game with a massive ego, where he feels like he's the most experienced chef there and that he'll dominate, only for him to make a bevy of mistakes across multiple services here. Where rather bad, he has a pretty lackluster signature dish, and he follows it up with a pretty bad service 1, where he ends up floundering on the fish station, screwing up lobster tail after lobster tail. And despite this, he actually manages to avoid nomination, which is actually pretty insane. Though at the same time, with Tad being a pretty clear outlier, it kind of makes sense. But obviously moving forward, like, he doesn't do that well, where we get to service 3, where he ends up smearing cold butter on a steak, which obviously is pretty bad. You also have him getting on Ramsey's nerves during that service as well, and he is eventually nominated for this, but again, he kind of skates on by. Service 5 is also pretty bad, where he ends up cooking a fish ahead of time, which gets on Ramsey's nerves, and it also forces Devon to have to rush his dish, which obviously leads to that turning sour, but obviously he's nominated again for this, but he's able to get out of that. In Service 7, he's named one of the weakest chefs in the game, and through that he is put into the challenge. But again, I do feel like a minor pro here is that he is the first one to win his safety in that challenge, which I do feel like is a minor pro here. But then he goes right back downhill, where in the following service, he ends up making a mistake on the fish station. Service 9, he ends up calling out 12 minutes for the order, which gets on Ramsey's nerves. And he ends up screwing up a Wellington that was meant to go out to Jay's wife, which is pretty bad. And he's eventually nominated for the 3rd time on the season. We then get to service 10, where he ends up making a bevy of mistakes across every aspect of that service, and it eventually culminates in him trying to blame Jay and Christina for the instructions that they gave him during prep, which ends up being a really terrible look in Ramsey's eyes, and he's eventually nominated again, but he somehow survives this round, even though there was a serious argument for him to go out here, given how bad this service is. And then we get to the Earn the Black Jacket challenge, where again, he is eventually taken out here due to being the weakest link left. So obviously in a lot of ways, Jason's run here ends up being pretty rocky. Where on one hand, he was pretty despised by a lot of his team due to how cocky he was. He ends up making a ton of mistakes over the course of the season, and obviously he is nominated a bevy of times during his run here. But the reason I have him at least this high on the list is Again, he does at least have some skill to go with his ego. I mean, we do see Ramsey giving him plenty of chances over the course of the season, and I feel like the fact that he does eventually win his safety during the Cook for Your Life challenge is a minor pro to him as well. But again, the fact that he was so disliked by his team, the fact that he made a bevy of mistakes over the course of the season, was enough to have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we are rounding out the pre-Black Jacket boots. But number 8, we do have a Toya. And I feel like a Toya is a pretty inconsistent chef across the season. Right at the bat, she has a pretty bad signature dish, and she follows it up with a pretty bad service 1 on the meat station. And she is nominated here, but she's able to scrape through that. Service 2 is okay, where while her team is kicked out, she doesn't really make any mistakes there. Service 3 is also not great, where she's on the fish station and she ends up dropping some fries before the order was ready. But then she does kind of rebound in Service 4, where she doesn't really make any mistakes there. Service 5 is also pretty good, where she's on the fish station. And then in Service 6, she also does pretty well on the appetizers. So again, that is a solid stretch for her, having 3 solid services in a row. But then we get to episode 8, which is pretty bad for Toya, where she does pretty poorly at the initial reward challenge, and she gets so upset by this that she considers quitting. And while Demir does talk her out of it, I feel like that's a pretty bad sign for her moving forward. And then she is thrown into the Cook for Your Life challenge, to where she is the last person to get her safety there. So again, that particular episode is pretty bad for her. And then we get to the following episode where she is swapped over to the blue team. And to be fair, she actually does pretty well at that next service, kind of proving herself there. But then she falls right back down to earth in service 9, where she ends up screwing up on the fish station, having a really bad service there. We even have Gordon pulling her aside to tell her to get a grip. And then she's eventually put up and eliminated here, which is all pretty bad. So again, I feel like a Toya's game is pretty hard to assess. I feel like it's a pretty rocky game in the grand scheme of things. The main reason I have her above Jason, however, is I feel like she at least had more highs compared to Jason, and plus she wasn't as hated by her team compared to Jason, so I feel like that was just enough to leave her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, we have the highest ranked pre-Blackjack boot left to talk about, and here we have Danya. And in some ways, Danya's run is similar to Otoya's, where there are some highs and there are some lows. I feel like Danya has a stronger start than Toya, where she has a good signature dish and she has a pretty solid first service. But then she kind of fumbles the ball on service 2, where she does poorly on the fish station, and she is nominated there, but is able to get through that. But I feel like after that, she's able to recover pretty well, where for the next couple services, she does pretty solidly, where her service 5 in particular is pretty strong, where Ramsey gives her a shout out for doing well there. And again, for a lot of the early games, she does pretty well. However, I feel like after the Cook for Your Life round, she kind of goes downhill, where in Service 8, she does pretty poorly, where she ends up costing her team the service by not finishing in time, where she gets nominated for her second time. Service 9 is also pretty bad, where she does pretty poorly on the fish station, makes tons of mistakes there. She's nominated yet again. And then we get to her boot round in Service 10, where she's assigned to plate dishes, but she does a pretty poor job at leading her team, to where she is eventually put up and eliminated for her bad leadership. So again, it is kind of a game defined by highs and lows. And to be fair, I actually consider putting her above the next person we'll be talking about. However, the reason I didn't is I feel like her downfall in the last couple of rounds are pretty bad. Then also her service 2 not being particularly great. I did decide to leave her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and obviously we are now on to the Black Jackets. It's just a matter of ordering them. By number 6, we are actually breaking away from the boot order again, and here we have Carmen. And I did actually consider having Carmen below Danya, as despite her making it all the way to Black Jackets, I find her run here to be pretty rocky. Now, right off the bat, she does have a good signature dish, but then she follows it up with a pretty bad service where she doesn't really communicate well with her team, where she ends up putting up a dish before the meat station is ready. Service 2 is also pretty bad, where she once again struggles with communication. She also tries to jump into the garnish station, which ends up getting on Ranisha's nerves. And she actually was considered to be nominated here by Danya. However, she's able to avoid that situation. Now, similar to Danya, she does actually manage to recover from this point on, where, again, a lot of her run here is mostly solid. Now, yes, she does make some mistakes here and there, but nothing that really rises to the level of a bad service. It's really not until service 9 that she kind of goes back downhill, where she struggles a lot on the meat station, where she's slow to get out orders, and she was eventually nominated here. Actually, her first time being nominated all season, but she's able to scrape through that. We get to service 10, which is not particularly great, where she calls out a wrong order and people are just kind of middling on her leadership, but she's able to avoid the block there. We then get to the Earn the Black Jacket challenge, where she is the fourth to earn her Black Jacket there. And again, kind of like in the middle of the pack. And then we get to the actual Black Jackets themselves, where she has a pretty bad service on the meat station. Though to be fair, most people had a bad service there. But obviously she's on the meat station, and she kind of gets saved by the fact that Lee and Demir ended up making bigger mistakes during that service, when she very easily could have gone up and been eliminated herself. And then we get to the final four, where while she doesn't do a terrible job on the pass, where she does pass 2 of the 3 quality control tests, she also does make some mistakes during that service as well. And by that point, she was clearly the weakest chef left, to where it was pretty obvious she was going home. So again, it is kind of a rough run to look at, especially for someone who made it that deep into the game. But again, while she did have plenty of bad services, I feel like she was consistent enough during most of the season that allowed her to skate her way to the Black Jackets. So I figured that was enough to have her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and straight up from this point on the list, I feel like all 5 of these chefs are all very strong in their own right. I feel like had they played on an older season of the show, they would have been in a very powerful position to get to the end and potentially win. But due to the fact that this was a highly competitive season, obviously I have to rank them accordingly. By number 5, I do have the weakest chef of this bunch, and here we have Lee. And again, while I never thought Lee had much of a shot of winning based off her edit, I feel like she was a mostly solid chef across the season. Now yes, she doesn't have the greatest signature dish in the world where she overcooks some salmon, but again, I feel like a lot of her early game is pretty strong, where before service 4, she doesn't really make a single mistake based off what we saw on the show. Now yes, service 4 isn't great, where she makes some mistakes on the meat station, but even then she's able to fix it by the end of the service, so there's that. She also wins at best of the worst during service 9, which is pretty good as well, where she displays some good leadership. And again, I feel like a lot of her run before the Black Jackets is pretty solid. But I will say that from the Black Jackets on, she does kind of go downhill, where obviously the Black Jacket challenge isn't great, where she ends up being the 5th person to get her Black Jacket, which on most other seasons will be the last spot there. So I feel like that's not ideal. And then we get to her first service, where obviously she does pretty poorly there, where we even have her admitting that she never sliced a Wellington before, which is pretty funny. And she's eventually put up and eliminated here. Now, yes, everyone kind of did poorly at this service, but I feel like the fact that she already was second to last and getting her Black Jacket was a pretty bad omen for her prospects moving forward. So again, it is one where she kind of tapers out by the end of it, but I also feel like she succumbs to the fact that there was pretty strong competition in the end game, and I feel like on most other seasons she probably would have done better. So I feel like Lee as a whole is a pretty solid chef, but again, with the rest of the competition, I feel like I had to leave her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we are actually breaking away from the boot order yet again. But we actually have Sammy, the 3rd place finisher on the season. And again, this placement is not an indication that Sammy's a bad chef per se. I just feel like the top 3 chefs are more solid in my opinion and played more solid games. But obviously Sammy is pretty similar to Lee in that she has a mostly solid run across the season, having a good signature dish, and really for a lot of the season not making too many mistakes, where yes, she does make a mistake in service 3 by putting up a raw halibut, but along the way, she also has plenty of good moments, like in service 4, where she takes a leadership role during that service, and really she gets through a lot of the pre-Black Jacket phase without too much difficulty. We then get to the Black Jacket challenge, where she does pretty well, getting her jacket during the first challenge, which is all pretty good. We then get to the final 6 service, which despite it being a disaster as a whole, I feel like Sammy herself did pretty well in that service, being one of the few chefs there to not really make any mistakes. Her final 4 service is fine, where she does well in the pass, though at the same time she is the last to earn her spot in the final 3, which I feel like was a pretty clear sign of where she was going moving forward. And then we get to the final 3 service, where she obviously does pretty well in the challenge, but ends up getting cut there. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Sammy's run is clearly a step above Lee's and Carmen's, where I feel like she was a very solid chef across the season, and if I ever get around to doing a final boot ranking, I expect Sammy to be relatively high on that list. However, I feel like compared to the top 3, I feel like those top 3 have higher highs in my opinion, whereas I feel like Sammy was kind of more under the radar for a lot of the season, which is why she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Demir. And obviously Demir was cut in 5th place after having a pretty bad final 6 service. However, I feel like his run before that was extremely impressive. Now he does have a bad signature dish right at the bat where he ends up using boxed pasta, which, why? However, I feel like after that, he ends up playing an extremely impressive game, being a pretty clear leader for the blue team for a lot of the season, and also not really making many mistakes during a lot of the season, where we see him in Service 5 being a pretty clear leader for his team there, where he ends up helping Brad calm down, and even Ramsey shouts him out for having a good service there. Service 6 is also pretty strong, where he's once again a pretty solid leader, and he even wins Best of the Worst there, and he's even able to win another Best of the Worst following Service 9, which is all pretty impressive. So again, he is a pretty solid chef across the season, and he was pretty clearly respected by a lot of the people there, having very solid relationships with a lot of the cast, and I feel like it just made sense for him to get through a lot of the game there, where really his only bad service across the season is the one where he's eliminated in, where it's the final 6, and he obviously does pretty poorly on the fish station, making tons of mistakes there. However, at the same time, most of the cast was also making tons of mistakes at that service, so in general, it was just a pretty disastrous service, and while he was nominated for this service, we saw Lee being eliminated first at that round, where obviously he probably would have been safe in most circumstances, but due to Ryan being given a 6th black jacket, that kind of forced Ramsey to do a double boo at that round, and through that, it kind of screws over Demir, where even though he had that one bad service, that also just happened to be the round where Ramsey had to cut 2 people. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Demir was kind of screwed over by kind of being bad at the wrong time. However, I feel like outside of that, his run here is extremely impressive, where I feel like he was more out in front than a lot of other people on the cast, and I feel like had he survived this particular round, he would have been a pretty threatening chef coming into that final 5 round, to where I very well could have seen him getting his way towards the end of the game, and I feel like that's a big reason why I have him as high as he is. But at the end of the day, he was still cut in 5th place, and I feel like the top 2 should be pretty obvious, so because of that, I do have him here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and obviously it is the final 2 on the season, and I actually did deliberate a little bit on the order here, as I feel like one of these chefs has a pretty big upside, but also a pretty big downside to their game. However, at number 2, I did decide to go with the chef that lacked those downsides, and here we have Jonathan. And obviously, Jonathan is a very strong chef, a very strong runner-up on the show's history, and I feel like he has a pretty clean run from most of the season. Right at the bat, he has a strong signature dish, and moving forward, he doesn't really make too many mistakes here, where yes, in Service 2, he does screw up after trying to help Matthias on the meat station. However, moving forward, like we very rarely see him making mistakes during an actual service here, and he kind of gets through a lot of the game because of that. Now, he does have a minor hiccup in Service 10, the round before the Black Jackets, where Jason gets onto him for not noticing the scallops were overcooked, and we even see Jason calling him out at the nomination, which obviously really annoys Jonathan, but again, he was never in serious danger at that point. We then get to the Black Jacket challenge, where he ends up doing so well at the first challenge that Ramsey hands him a Black Jacket on the spot before even finishing tasting the other dishes, which I feel like is pretty good there. However, we then get to the first Black Jacket round, which obviously ends up being pretty bad for him, where obviously he takes a lot of Ramsey's comments to heart, and he ends up having a pretty bad service on the garnish station, where he's kind of up and down there. And while he does avoid nomination, we also see Ramsey telling him to get a grip, and obviously that's a pretty bad look for him. And even moving forward, while he does okay at the next couple of services, he also kind of gets outclassed by Ryan in terms of his leadership, where he doesn't do the best on the pass. However, he's able to avoid nomination there. And then we get to the final 3, where he's obviously second in the challenge, where obviously it's down to him and Sammy, and he kind of has to do very well at that last dish in order to get into the final 2. And then we get to the final service, where while he does all right in terms of managing his team to where he ends up moving Danya to the meat station after Demir struggles, I feel like by that point, Ryan was such a clear leader compared to Jonathan that kind of outshined him to a degree. So obviously he does kind of fall towards the end of the game, but even then, like his downfall isn't that bad. It was more so that Ryan was clearly a better leader compared to him. Then also his final six service being pretty bad. Those are obviously some key knocks that kind of hold Jonathan back from winning. So I did kind of debate over whether to have Jonathan here at number one, as obviously I feel like he has a more consistent run during a lot of the season than many other chefs in Hell's Kitchen history. But at the end of the day, I feel like his competition outplayed him by the end of it, which is a big reason he is here at number two. And now at number one, the chef I believe did the best on Hell's Kitchen The American Dream is Ryan, the winner of this season. And again, it was very much a debate for me between Jonathan and Ryan, particularly with the whole Black Jacket situation, but I'll get to that more in a minute. In terms of his actual run here, it is pretty solid for a lot of it. I feel like a lot of his run is pretty similar to Jonathan's, where he is able to get through a lot of the game without too much trouble, where he has a good signature dish, and we even see him taking charge during that first service, which is all pretty good. Where moving forward, he doesn't make too many mistakes. Now, yes, in service 3, he does put up a raw lamb, and he was considered for nomination here, but is able to avoid the block there. But beyond that, he doesn't really make many mistakes during a lot of it. We then get to the Black Jackets, which is obviously the biggest hole in this game, where obviously he fails to be in the top 5 for that challenge, and considering that on previous seasons before this, it was only a 5-person Black Jacket, he probably should have been eliminated here. However, Ramsay took such a liking to him that he decided to give Ryan an extra Black Jacket, which is something that hadn't been done in a lot of recent seasons. And obviously, I'm very conflicted about how this impacts his game. Where on one hand, this is obviously a pretty big knock to him, in the sense that he thought he was going home here, as obviously in previous seasons, he probably would not have made the cut here in the top 5. And also, in the process of Ramsay handing him an extra Black Jacket, it obviously forced the producers to have to do a double boot round, which obviously later screws over Demir, who would have been a massive competition threat to Ryan down the road. So obviously those things are all pretty bad, and I feel like they kind of benefit Ryan in ways that most other winners in Hell's Kitchen history would not have benefited from. However, at the same time, I don't think this completely detracts from his winning game either, as it obviously highlights his very strong relationship with Ramsay, where Ramsay was so impressed by him that despite him not doing well in the challenge, Ramsay decided to bend the rules to give Ryan another chance. So I feel like that kind of balances it out to a degree. Then also, Ryan does play pretty lights out from this point on, where at the final 6, despite that service doing pretty poorly, Ryan himself doesn't make many mistakes there, kind of like Sammy. We then get to the final 4 round, where he obviously does incredibly well on the pass, being a very assertive leader, and obviously made him a pretty big shoe-in to earn a spot in the final 3. And then obviously we get to the final 3 where he does very well in the challenge, wins that challenge pretty handily, being the first to secure a spot in the final 2. And again, I feel like he just does better than Jonathan in the final service, where obviously he was such a pretty clear leader during a lot of that service. And he was also able to rein in Jason, who was obviously a pretty big troublemaker during a lot of the season, which I feel like further impressed Ramsay to where it made sense by the end of it that Ryan would win it. So again, obviously Ryan's game has that one pretty big flaw in terms of him being stayed at the Black Jackets, which obviously made his run to the end a little bit easier. But at the same time, I feel like he played well enough during most of the season before that, and I feel like he outplayed a lot of his competition after that point to where it made sense why Ramsay decided to give him the win by the end of it. And I feel like those highs were enough to give Ryan the edge for me over Jonathan, to where I have him here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week with more Hell's Kitchen rankings, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.